All right, good morning. This is a place type webinar. We'll give it a couple more minutes to make sure that everybody is logged in. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get all right, good morning. My name is Dharma Bennett, and I'm with the Office of Information Management and Analysis, or OIMA, here at the State Board. Today we're going to be talking about place types, and so we'll get on with it. Before we get into the subject matter, I do want to go over a few ground rules. Since we do have a number of people on the line, we all need to do our part to try to reduce the background noise. And we are having some moving around here, so hopefully you guys won't be able to hear that. It's in other rooms, but it's pretty loud, so hopefully it won't be a bother. But if you can use your mute button on your phone or use *6 to mute and unmute your line, and that would be great. We welcome clarifying questions or comments such as slow down or can you repeat that, but we do request that you save other questions such as a request for enhancements or trying to find out about a data error, etc. Please wait until the end so we can make sure to get through the core subject material. You can also use the chat feature in WebEx, and this time please send the message to Erin. She is sitting right here watching all the chats come in, and she can make sure that your questions or comments either get answered individually or presented to the group or takes the appropriate action. In this webinar, I'm going to go through some background information, examine the place type field, talk about defining regulated places, and we do have some exercises, and then we'll review regulated versus not regulated places, discuss the entry of the waste type field, and we'll have another exercise there, and then briefly talk about some related future plans. So I mentioned that we have some exercises. This is a new feature for us in the SWRCB webinars to try to do exercises. We're going to use the polling feature in WebEx to try to do this. So to get us started, I'm going to make sure everybody knows how to do this. And so we're going to just have a poll about what office or region do you represent. So hopefully, I've opened the poll, and if you're not seeing the polling window, you may have to use your toolbar and select polling. And so we would like you to, oh, I see some answers coming in. So just mark the region that you're from. If you're in a big group, please designate somebody to mark the answer for you. And since hopefully this is an easy question, I'm going to go ahead and just give you a couple more seconds to use that polling feature until I close the poll. All right, we've given it about 50 seconds, so I'm going to, oh, we still have some answers coming in, so give it a full minute. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close that poll, and we can view the poll results. Okay. So it looks like we have some representation from most of the regions and some of the offices, so that's great. If you had any problems locating the polling window or using the polling feature, go ahead and send that chat to Erin. If it seems like everybody's having the same question or problem, we'll address it for the whole group. But we would like you to be able to participate. So, all right. Thank you. I can close that up. Now moving on to place types. So just as a review, places in SWRCB represent any geographic location. They can be water bodies, they can be regulated sites like wastewater treatment plants or power plants, anything that we have interest in, we can make a place record in SWRCB. So we have this field called place type to describe the place. But we were finding that we needed more categories to better describe the places we regulate, increase the ability to answer basic questions such as, how many wastewater treatment plants do we regulate, how many power plants do we regulate, things along those lines. We needed more categories to produce more meaningful performance measures and to allow for more valid comparisons. So we're comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges, in terms of places. So we wanted to add more place types, but we got to this place where we didn't want to just add a long list of places because that would just be a long, overwhelming list, which we thought would lead to frustration from the person who was trying to do the data entry, and then ultimately lead to mistakes in entering that data. And just having a long list wouldn't necessarily lend itself to querying at different levels and for reporting out.
Not yet.
So our solution was a new list using a dynamic hierarchy. And when you hover over the options, then the application automatically displays subsequent options. So I've just taken a screenshot here. When you are, again, it comes out to different menus when you hover over one menu item. So I hovered over physical site, and the next menu came up, discharge source, monitoring location. From those two choices, I hovered on discharge source, and then I got the subsequent option of non-point source. We thought this was a good solution because the dynamic nature of the subsequent menus makes it easier to see what's available. And so if you're not sure that your first choice is correct, you can see what else is in that menu, those lower levels, to see if you're going in the right direction. If it's not correct, you just hover on something else and see what is available through that option. So we wanted to reduce the amount of clicking and waiting and refreshing that you needed to do. Also, having it split into these categories allows that more slicing and dicing when querying. So again, that reporting at different levels. Along with these changes, and in part the reason for this webinar is to define or clarify the usage of this field. And we're calling this a regulatory description trifecta because you use combinations of fields to paint the regulatory picture. We're focusing a lot on place type. We can also use waste type and program, again, to really paint the picture of what's going on. And again, it's not necessarily new depending on how you used this field before, but we're trying to clarify the usage. So getting onto that, the place type field should describe the primary activity at the site, which is not necessarily the activity being regulated by the water board order, and it's not, we're trying to separate it out from waste type because that's a separate entry. So again, it's the primary activity at the site. So for example, we have the operators of a campground apply for a 401 certification to do improvements at the campground that include dredging and filling at the site. So when I enter this place into SWRCB, I'll use the place type of campground, not dredge and fill, because the primary activity at the site is being a campground. So that was kind of, I think, an easier example to kind of get the idea, but it can get complicated if there's a lot going on at the site, within the site, around the site, and so you really have to think about, in some cases, how you're drawing your box around the site, and so that will then dictate how what place type you use, and you want to draw that box as small as possible to encompass that activity. So an example for this more complicated situation is a power plant. So at the power plant, you'll have cooling water, boilers, low down water, a sewage stream, a surface impoundment. All of these items are there to support the power plant. And so when I enter this site into SWRCB, I'll enter a power plant as the place type, even though there may be, as I noted here, there's a lot of other things going on at the site. But again, it's all tied to being a power plant, supporting that activity. And that's pretty much where I said, draw your box around the whole power plant, because that's why the site exists, being a power plant. So now we're going on to our first exercise, which is an application comes in for a new wastewater treatment plant for a new town. And so where do you draw your box for that place? And again, how you draw your box then dictates what place type that is. So here's our schematic. We have our town, and in our town we have some residential areas, a park, some businesses, and our wastewater treatment or sewage treatment plant. So how do we draw our box around this, the place that we want to enter into SWRCB? Option A is to draw it around the whole town. Option B is to draw it just around the wastewater treatment plant. Option C is to draw it around just the residential area because that's kind of where most of the wastewater is coming from. The sewage is coming from. So now we're going to use our polling feature again, and for you to record how you think the box should be drawn. Let me just open this up and open poll. Okay, so again, select A, B, or C on how the box should be drawn for the site that you're going to be entering into SWRCB. It looks like most people are finished. We've got a few more to go. But nobody else is participating, so I'm going to go ahead and close that poll and share the results. Okay, so great. We have that we did get the majority of the people saying option B, so that's good. You would draw the box just around the wastewater treatment plant, and so then when you enter your place type field, you would use wastewater treatment plant because that's what's in your box. So the reason for the wastewater treatment plant existing is to treat sewage, and so that's what the application came in for. So that's why you would draw your box that way. In terms for the whole entire city, on the other hand, a lot of different things are happening for that within that city, and most of them don't have to do with treating domestic sewage. You know, there could be another reason why we would regulate the entire city. For example, an MS4 permit, and in that example, you wouldn't draw your box around the whole city. But for this example, with the wastewater treatment plant, we're really just interested in that the treatment plant, and so that's how we would draw our box. So great. And we'll move on to our next example. Here we have our military base. And we have, again, a lot of different things going on here. We have a cleanup site. We have a landfill. I put in it kept in the airfield picture just to remind us that it does have military activity, so that's not necessarily something we put into SWRCB. And then we have, again, our sewage treatment plant. So thinking along the same lines as the exercise we just did, how would we draw our box? Would we draw it around just the cleanup site? Would we draw it around just the landfill? Would we draw it around just the sewage treatment plant? Or would we draw it around the whole site, the whole military base? Or would we do all of the above? So, again, we'll use the polling feature. Let's open that up. To select your answer on how we should be drawing the box, or in this case, the boxes. Alright. Like, people that are answering have answered, so I'm going to close the poll. There are the results. This one is definitely a little trickier, and it really does depend on what is actually going on at the site. If we're not regulating multiple places within the site, it'll turn out differently. But in this case, in the example that I was showing, I think the correct answer is to create a place record for the discrete places that we're regulating within the base, and then a place for the overall base, and then link the sites together using the related places tab of each place record. And we have directional relationships there, so you can really, again, paint that picture of what's going on at the site. We did have some different answers this time, and so not everybody got the E answer, and so I think the best answer in this case is to make individual sites and then also an overall site. But again, it does depend on the specific details of what is actually being regulated at the military site.
Yeah, and the way, I think this warrants further discussion based on the comments I'm getting. This is also enables us to answer more than one question about this particular site, because we can answer the question, how many military sites do we have in the state of California? But we can also answer the question, how many sewage treatment plants do we have in California?
That's a good point. Yeah, I always think about what it means in terms of what questions we are trying to answer with the information. All right, so now we'll move back over to kind of the nuts and bolts of the list itself. You want to be sure to select the lowest value, and I have a screenshot of that in a minute. It's the most descriptive value that you can select. And there are some unselectable values that appear when you use the menu. These would be considered the parents, such as facility or agriculture, because those ones break down. They have sub-menus under those values. And so we want to always know go to the lowest level, the most descriptive option. Also, we have a value groundwater cleanup site that appears as if it's the lowest value. However, that value is really an artifact of our old menu, and so we have preserved it for existing data, but do not want people to continue to use it because it doesn't describe the activity, the primary activity at the site in most cases. You'll also notice that there are some values that have NEC or not elsewhere classified in it, and this you can kind of think of as the other option within that category. So here we have what it's trying to describe as the lowest level, and you know it's the lowest level because there are no more arrows. If you look at the screen here, we've selected facility, that has an arrow. We go to agriculture, that has an arrow. We go to animals, that has an arrow. We go to growing, that has an arrow. Finally, we get to animal feeding and aquaculture or /hatchery. You don't see any other arrows there, so you know that's the lowest level, and that's the level at which we would be wanting to select. And this pathway has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 boxes. They don't all have 5 boxes, 5 subsequent menus. It just depends on the path. Again, we have our not elsewhere classified option, or options, because you'll see it in a couple different places. Here we have facilities, domestic service facility, and we have our submenu under that has domestic site, not elsewhere classified, residence/education, utility, or waste management unit. So if I were off, for some reason, regulating a office building, maybe they have a dewatering permit or something, that would be considered a domestic site, not elsewhere classified, because the office building doesn't provide a residence, and it's not an educational facility, it's not a utility, it's not a waste management unit, but it is where, we kind of live our lives, as you might say, and so that's why it would go under a domestic site, not elsewhere classified. Again, you can think of that as kind of the other option within the category that you're talking about. So now we a new concept we've added here is regulated versus not regulated. And it kind of, I think a better way to maybe think of it is regulated or potentially regulated versus not regulated or not potentially regulated. So for regulated or potentially regulated, that's a site that is discharging that we would issue a permit or order for. So even if you got a call about, you got a complaint for an unregulated discharge, well, if it's something that we would then say, okay, send in your application because we're going to issue an order, that's a potentially regulated site. So you would select the radio button that is associated with the regulated option. The not regulated option is for water bodies, management units, things of that nature. And so what we did is added this radio button or question, place is regulated, yes or no, before the primary place type menu in order to kind of filter what options you see in the place type menu. So if you select yes or the place is regulated, you get all the options associated with facilities and children of facilities. Those are the ones that we're kind of focused on in this webinar and are the majority of the sites that are entered in, or the majority of places that are entered into SWRCB. And we also put discharge points into this category. That is the lowest level for that pass. If you say no to places regulated, you get the option for water bodies, hydrologic units, etc. And you see here, when you go to the subsequent menu, once you've answered no, then you don't get the facility option, and then further the children of facility options, the wastewater treatment plants, the power plants, those things, those aren't an option. And again, we added this additional field to try to make the place type menu less cumbersome and straightforward, and more straightforward. We want to note about searches. In the place module itself, when you're searching for a place, there's a checkbox that allows you to search for children of what you're searching for. So if you say you're searching for a utility or a domestic site, that's one that we talked about already. You search for domestic site and you have that checkbox checked as is the default, you'll get the domestic services not elsewhere classified site, you'll get the residence and / education sites, you'll get the utility sites, all those things that you see as children of domestic services facilities. However, in the regulatory measure module, you don't get the dynamic hierarchy menu. It looks a little different. It's written out kind of the old-fashioned way, the way you used to do it. And when you search for a specific value, you only get that specific value. So if you search for hydromodification, you only get, well, actually, you don't get, it doesn't return a child of hydromodification, which is a dredge and fill place. And if you don't search for anything specific in the regulatory measure module, however, that criteria isn't used, and it will just return any place type that fits your other, where the place fits your other criteria. And while it doesn't have the same menu that I've been showing screenshots of that's in the place type or the place module, it does show you the whole hierarchy, the path and the categories, but written out, again, the way we used to do it. And then just our typical reports, it generally displays the lowest value, and most of our reports are dynamic. So if there are values, if there's data that has those values used, those will display as options in your search criteria. As I mentioned, we are using waste type and program as well as place type to further define what is going on at the site to paint that regulatory picture. I'm not going to talk much about, or I'm not going to talk about program today, but wanted to talk about a little about the place type, or I'm sorry, the waste type field. We have made modifications to this drop-down list as well. You will find this field, waste type, on the additional info tab of a regulatory measure record. It can have multiple values, so you do want to select as many as are applicable to the regulatory measure. And this waste type field describes the discharge being regulated. And so if you had a winery, for example, that had a mix of winery waste and domestic sewage, you would pick both domestic sewage and processed waste. And so it would have multiple values. Before I go into this exercise, I am going to go into, I'm going to try to go into, I'm going to try to go into the SWRCB and show that waste type because I didn't have a screenshot in there. So as I mentioned, it is in the regulatory measure module. I'm just going to pick out any record just to show you where it is and show you the options there. So here's your regulatory measure record. You go down to the additional info tab. And then scroll down to the W's, and you have this waste type field. It hasn't been used consistently yet, but we hope that this new concentration on using multiple fields to describe really what's going on will help make it more popular. And here is the options you get. You would, if you have multiple, you would select one, save it, and then select your next one. That's the waste type field. Now we're going to switch back to our presentation and do an exercise about waste types at a prison. So here we have our prison, our standard sewage treatment plant, and then we happen to have some construction going on at the prison, so they're needed a dewatering permit, potentially. So in this example, you have our place type equals prison, because that's the main activity of why the site exists. We have one regulatory measure for the wastewater treatment plant. We have the second regulatory measure for the dewatering permit. So what waste type should be used? So for first option is that for regulatory measure 1, you assign the waste type of domestic wastewater and uncontaminated groundwater. For regulatory measure 2, you use the same both options, domestic wastewater and uncontaminated groundwater. Option B is that for regulatory measure 1, you use the waste type of domestic wastewater, and for regulatory measure 2, you use the waste type of uncontaminated groundwater. And then for option C is that you use the waste type of domestic wastewater and uncontaminated groundwater, and that you don't specify one for regulatory measure 2. So now we'll use the polling feature again to for you guys to select the correct option. Get that open. Okay, so it's A, domestic and groundwater for both regulatory measures, B, domestic for one regulatory measure, groundwater for the other regulatory measure, and C, domestic and groundwater for one regulatory measure and nothing for the other regulatory measure. Go ahead and record your answer. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And it looks like most of the people did get answer B, which is the correct answer. Regulatory measure 1 gets assigned domestic wastewater, and regulatory measure 2 gets assigned uncontaminated groundwater. Again, waste type goes with the regulatory measure, so you just look at what that regulatory measure is doing, and the waste it's regulating, and assign that waste type field according to that specific regulatory measure. We do have some future plans. The first thing that we want to do is to add attributes based on place type. So for example, for food, if you have the place type of food processor, you get additional questions such as what type of food is being processed or the volume of products they're producing. And those would show up on the additional information tab of the place record. And if you're a food processor, you get the food processor questions. If the place type is power plant, you have a different type of question. And so in that way, it's dynamic there as well. And again, we wanted to get more information so we can be able to answer questions that we get. Also, we anticipate needing to add new place type values, but they will be added in accordance with the structure we have in place with the dynamic hierarchy model.
I'm sorry, a question. Would winery be considered a food processor? Or is it an agricultural site?
It's a food processor. That's do want to mention, we have definitions for all of the lowest level selections, and I anticipate having those posted next week. And where, if we hop over back over to CWIGS and go to the place module. I did show you some screenshots of this, but this is where you see places regulated. We have a C definitions link here. At this point, it just kind of tries to describe what that specific field is place regulated, how to answer that. But the definitions for all the values will also be posted here, and so easily accessible. For additional information, the SWRCB intranet site is a good resource for business rules and other information such as the issues that were recently released. If you have questions, please contact myself or the SWRCB Help Center. And again, the SWRCB intranet can be a resource. Go ahead and open it up to questions and put up the contact information.
I have some questions. One of them, did you cover the groundwater treatment site and why it shows up now?
I did recap. It still shows up because it has it's under our old list. It was a value, and we didn't know how to migrate it to one of our new values. So for existing data that uses that place type, you see it, but you can't select it for new, if you're entering new places or going back and editing existing places. If you're entering a new site today that that was covered under a groundwater treatment order, you would pick the and going back to what our place type is describing the primary activity at the site, and so that's basically generally what caused the contamination. So if it was a dry cleaner, for example, we don't have dry cleaner itself as an option, but you would pick industrial and services facility to describe that kind of the type of facility it is. So if I look at my list, industrial and commercial services, and we go down to service/commercial and select service commercial site not elsewhere classified. And so this is an area where if we got a bunch of, seemed like we had a whole bunch of dry cleaners that warranted a separate entry, we would just add it to this list that you see here. And then you'd still have the not elsewhere classified option. If you were entering a dry cleaner, you would pick the dry cleaner option, but if you were entering something else, you would pick the not elsewhere classified option. Does that answer the question?
It's not my question.
Okay.
No. And then I think Anthony wants to clarify the difference. He's been bothering me the whole time about the difference between a power plant and a military base, and why the locations at the power plant are the locations at the power plant are not discrete, whereas the locations at the military base we consider discrete. And so, again, I think we want to revisit the fact that most examples will be intuitive. I mean, most of the time you're selecting a place type is going to be intuitive. It's going to just be, but in these cases, maybe it's less so. And we brought up the idea of the power plant because, there's all sorts of waste streams and different structures that are included in the power plant, but the primary thing that we're regulating is for the purpose of generating power. And so I guess he was confused because a military base could have a hazardous waste site, it could have a sewage treatment plant, and it can have all this, but its primary function is the military base. The question is how much detail do you care about each discrete facility? That's how I would answer the question. When I think of the power plants and the little sewage, the package plants that they have, they also have an intake structure. They have where they pull water in for the cooling water. They have boilers where they use, water to blow them down. you know, so all these waste streams are combining, but the whole plant itself is what we're regulating.
I think this is why I titled the presentation "The Art of Place Types," because there is definitely gray area and some fuzzy lines about when you do break it up and when you don't break it up. And I think Aaron's point is how detailed do you need to get is a good one. I think looking at the intent of the power plant to generate power is makes sense to look at that site as this one individual site, whereas the military base is kind of like a small city and yet has some more organizational structure than a city does. The whole military base has to do with supporting the military base, yet it's within that very diverse, and so that's why we think breaking it up into smaller pieces and then relating them with an umbrella place is the appropriate path to take.
Yeah, and I don't know the particular base that was cited. So the bases I think that we were thinking about are the large bases where there are essentially cities amongst themselves. The main difference is the military is its own entity. It oversees every single facility, and they're interlinked, whereas the city is just a boundary. It's not
as we were talking about yesterday, we don't work for the city. We are going to our job that's outside the city, whereas everything in a military base is supporting that military base.
Yeah, that's true.
Have you got an example of a military base that's been put in right? We don't have an example.
I don't know if there is one. We didn't check them all out.
Yeah, I mean, as an example, just going back to the power plant, I've been to, I think, the most sophisticated power plant on the West Coast, and its treatment system was like a clarifier. I mean, it was just a little package. I would not call it a wastewater treatment plant. That is how, it's not a facility. We don't care it's barely treating the waste as it is. The power plant is there to generate power.
All right. Were there other questions that you
Yes,
see?
there's a good question. Should we be linking the place to hydrological areas? The huts and the...
It's kind of your region's decision, as it is not a business rule to do so. We want to move in the direction of using GIS to make those links, but some regions do use it, so you should consult your...
Yeah, and I would also suggest if you do want to use mapping and you want to be able to see the discharge point and where it is in relation to, I think you should, the lat and long of your monitoring and your locations and your discharge points is more critical than the hydrological location, because then we can use the other databases that have the defined hydrological, the HUCs, the defined HUCs, the defined water bodies, such as like Kalwaka and their data, like where the best waters are, and map them together. So I would say if you're going to focus on entering that data, focus on the lat and long of the places where the discharge is occurring or where you're monitoring.
Jarma?
Yes.
This is Region 5 Fresno. Regions, if weren't oil field charges, how, as places are still going to use the oil field name and lease name?
I'm sorry, you kind of had some feedback there. Could you repeat the question?
Yes. Region, if weren't have oil discharges, and are the places still going to at least Perez, the oil name and the name as the place current?
Yeah, something's breaking up about your phone. Can you send it in a chat? The question in the chat? We get about every third word for some reason.
existing. Oil field, it had to do, from what I understood, it the question had to do with oil fields and if they would use, I'm not sure how they are entered in as existing, but for this, under the new scheme, they're probably just facilities because I don't think we had anything more specific previously, that you would use oil and gas extraction. I think would be the best fit for that. There was also something about the place name, and for the place name, we don't expect that you would need to change anything about that. If we didn't grasp your question, yeah, use the chat, but hopefully that did cover it. Do you have any other, Erin?
Well, this question was, I think, a private question, but I think it merits discussing. You have a vineyard or surface water treatment plant with a low-threat dewater permit where they're doing hydrostatic testing. So the place type would be winery. The waste type would be, there would be two waste types. There would be sewage, and then I forgot, was it low, what is the dewatering?
Uncontaminated groundwater?
Yeah, that's right.
Or potable water. I don't think you really hydrostatic test with groundwater.
Okay.
Yeah, I think if that makes sense, Gary. There is a potable water option, so I think potable water. Use potable water option. But
we didn't exclude that one. Yeah, I'm just trying to think of what waste type would be. And they would be linked to their reg measure that they're applicable. If there's two reg measures, which is probably the case, one being a general and lowly, we'd pick that. Are oil fields a place type?
No, not oil fields written out like that as shown here, that you would use oil gas extraction. And this is an example of where we could use our attributes to get even more information, where we could ask, so what type of extraction device or area. You know, I'm not familiar enough with the topic to know, but it does sound like there are different extraction things, and so within that category, we can further define with using the attributes. All right, is there any other questions?
Jarmuth, just talking about those attributes, I want to get the word out that anybody that has any ideas about these attributes, please submit them to Jarmuth.
Yeah, please do. Like I said, you know, we usually work through these issues on the business rules team, and we try to have good representation, but we don't know all the topics, and so if you have ideas about that, as Gary said, please email me with those, and so we can get the start collecting the information that would be helpful to you.
I got one person likes the polling.
Well, yeah, that's another thing we'd like to know. You know, can email me, or if you wanted to try to be more anonymous, if you go through the help center potentially. And you know, your email name would still be there, where you could ask them not to share their name and to pass it on to me, something like that. So we can try to, if people like it, we can try to work it in more often. We were trying to be a little more interactive, but if it's cumbersome, you know, we don't have to.
It's anonymous, right? Too.
The polling is. Yeah.
That's the other thing is, if you do screw up, then nobody knows you did. So. Except if you're in a room full of people.
Yeah, you with the WebEx polling, at least you have the option of making it individual results or not.
Yeah.
And in this case, I did not use that option. Well, if there's nothing else, I want to thank you. It was kind of a difficult, and I think, as we said, there are examples that are more complicated, but I think those are hopefully the less frequent instances, and that much of your entry of places is straightforward, and that this new place type, menu, and structure is beneficial to everyone. So thanks again, and have a great day.